We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast, everyone. This is Abe, your host. Today we're doing a Leave the World Behind episode. As far as my updates, I'm going back to work today. It's my first day back after a week vacation. Go check out the podcast we put out last week. There's quite a few, some more Leave the World Behind, deep dive, 2 deep dives, the QR code conspiracy, the Lake Shawnee conspiracy. Then me and Sammy did a double feature vacation podcast on some ufology and a paranormal spot we went to. So go check it out. Chapter 14. Ruth woke with lucid eyes and sudden memory. That familiar sensation of jerking awake when you're falling asleep. Something you take for private idiosyncrasy, then learn it's part of the human condition. The quotation sounds of morning, water in pipes, someone else's footsteps, conversation from another room. She was desperate for Maya. She was in bed, but also still in the car, thinking of the girl. Baby at her breast, toddler on her lap. Tin with thick limbs and box braids, terse teen in a flannel shirt and too many earrings, a college girl, blushing wife, radiant mother. Every version of Maya overlapped in Ruth's mind. The green light on the cable box showed her that the power still flowed. Her cell phone still did not seem to reach the world, but she hadn't expected it to. She let George sleep, crept upstairs. In the kitchen, Ruth picked up the telephone Danny had suggested installing. The contractor had some kind of hold over George, men of GH's generation. Didn't think of affection for other men. That had made it more charming and then annoying to watch GA fall under Danny's spell. The man was a manual laborer. GH had gone to Harvard Business School. But Danny was muscled and capable in his chambray shirts, sleeves rolled over firm forearms, sunglasses perched on the back of his head. She pressed the receiver against her ear, not the steady basso of a phone ready to be dialed, the dirge that told you the thing was already dead. For a terrible moment, Ruth couldn't quite imagine the sound of her daughter's voice. What did Maya, today's Maya, the real person, sound like? As an adult, she was the same as she had been as a child, mostly bemused by her parents. She favored long, strange dresses and a riot of colors and patterns. Her children were called Beckett and Otto, and toddled around on the back lawn naked. Ruth didn't understand their names, or the fact that they had foreskins, but she kept this to herself. She put the phone down. Too forceful, maybe. The couple were in the living room. The man was barely dressed. The woman in her comfortable clothes. Amanda tried not to show that she was startled. Good morning. Ruth returned this pleasantry, as was normal. It wasn't insincere or inaccurate, or perhaps both. The telephone is still out. Amanda had alerts on her phone this morning. What did they say? Ruth wondered why her phone had told her nothing. She never could quite master the damn thing. The same thing, a blackout, then something about the hurricane, then an update, then something that was just gibberish. This was the third time she'd explained it. The information felt more meaningless now. Little side note, because we do commentary on here too, hence that it's a podcast. I wonder if the hurricane is man-made in weather warfare. That the blackout and the hurricane are both man-made and purposeful. Just an idea. Let's see. Let me get you some coffee, Clay said. He felt embarrassed, undressed. A hurricane. That's something. Ruth tried to make it mean something. Is it? Clay handed her a mug. Her mug. Well, yes, maybe it's related to the power outage. That could be. There was Hurricane Sandy, of course. I don't remember hearing that this one was bound for New York, but I wasn't paying close attention, I have to admit. They'd all heard. She knew that those storms of the century were going to be the storms of the decade. That there might have been a new category introduced to accurately describe the kinds of storms. Now humankind had so altered the ocean. I'm not sure what to tell the kids. Amanda looked at the stranger as though she might have some advice, then turned toward the French doors. And they all did. All looked at Rose, standing down in the yard. How old is she? Years ago, Ruth was asked to help out in the school office. Dalton wanted to increase diversity. Now Ruth was immune to kids' germs and most impervious to their charms. Just 13th last month, Amanda was protective. But still kind of a baby at heart, so I would love to keep things between the adults. There's no need to worry them. At school, Ruth treated kids as the selves they'd inevitably be. The boys who would turn out handsome and then therefore catered to. The girls who would turn out pretty and therefore cruel. The rich ones who would turn out to be Republicans. And the rich ones would become drug addicts. The rich ones who would exceed their parents' expectations of them. The poor ones who would prosper and the poor ones who would skulk from Princeton back to East New York. She knew that childhood was a temporary condition, but being a grandmother had made her soft. I don't want these kids to panic over nothing. Amanda tried not to imply that this was what Ruth and her husband had done. Ruth's mother would have invoked God. Life was about making sure your children did better than you did, and Ruth's atheism was a definite improvement. You can't get through life dismissing the incomprehensible as divine. I don't want to scare anyone, but she was afraid. Thank you for the coffee. There are eggs, cereal, you know. Clay held a banana, not knowing how like a primate he looked in that moment. I'm going to get dressed, he said, quite forgetting his promise to his daughter. He had a plan. But Ruth sat. She felt safe in small talk. So what is it you do? This Amanda understood. I'm in advertising. On the client side, manage relationships. She sat two, crossed one leg over the other. Ruth took her turn. I'm retired now. I was in admissions at the Dalton School. Amanda couldn't help sit up a little straighter. Perhaps there was an angle. Her children, not exceptional, still wondered in her estimation, could do with an advantage. She knew the tuition was a suggestion. Families like theirs relied on the largesse of luckier people. That's so interesting. From her old office, Ruth sometimes saw Woody Allen poking around in the office directly opposite. That was one of 3 or 4 interesting things about it. She was happy to be free. And your husband? Clay, he's a professor, English, but also media studies. I'm not sure I know what that means. She said it like a little joke on herself. Amanda was never entirely clear on it either. Films, literacy, the internet, the truth, that kind of thing. At Columbia? City College. Seemed like a disappointment since the woman's first guess had been the Ivy, but Amanda was proud. I was at Bernard, then Teachers College. Ruth was doing this routine because she wanted to understand these people a little better. It was a give and take. A true New Yorker, I went to Penn. Philadelphia seemed so urban to me, so exotic. She remembered driving onto campus, her parents' Corolla, bursting with jersey sheets, desk lamp, shower caddy, Tori Amos poster. The place had looked flat. She heard city and had been picturing buildings reaching for the sky. Still, it was better than Rockville. REM was right. Nobody says hello. Don't talk to anybody they don't know you. I wish I'd gone to college in New York. Well, I'm from Chicago. Ruth said it was the best to be from. Hang on just a second. Okay, never mind. Sorry about that. But I suppose I'm a true New Yorker now. More years than not. GH had dressed, skipping the dirty underwear and sweat-in socks, not bothering with the tie, and made up the bed. Not making up the bed was no kind of life. He had tried to prepare himself, the usual ablutions, but was vague about what he was preparing himself for. Good morning. Amanda stood to greet him. Some formality she did not know was her nature. Any news? He listened to Amanda's report of what they barely knew and wished he could see the news. But he also wished he could see the market. He wanted information, but also vindication. The storm, I'm sure, a downed limb. The landlines don't go, but the whole reason Danny said to put one in. Ruth didn't mind being mollified, but she did not want to be lied to. The power is still on. GH did not want this overlooked. Maybe today we could drive over to Danny's. If you were going to be under some kind of terrorist siege, you'd want to be with Danny. Who's Danny? Are there neighbors nearby? We passed that farm stand just before the turn onto the lane. There must be someone there. Maybe they know something. Amanda did not know that the itch she felt was so like the one that afflicted her husband. But he was too long without nicotine. She wanted away. What if collective hysteria, groups of people, got some malady that turns out to be just a shared delusion? Hundreds of people with tremors and fever imagining a rash. They can even make their skin turn pink. GH was only offering a theory. Ruth brought her husband a coffee. You're going to call me hysterical, the word people, men, use for women. Cassandra had, of course, been right about Troy. We saw the same thing. Something happened. Sure, I think we can agree. But this was a technicality. It was the nature of the world, things happening. You drove. She meant he ran. You were as afraid as me. Well, the elevator. Floor was termed the 14th, but it was not. The building lacked a 13th floor because that was terrible luck. Simply pretending it wasn't, there was better. Amanda felt embarrassed. She didn't know these people and couldn't watch them bicker. Where does Danny live? Not far. You can't afford to do anything in life without the right information. I'll drive you over there. GH looked out at the day. The morning looked odd to him, but he could not articulate why. Could not be certain. It was not context instead of fact. I don't want you going anywhere. Ruth scoffed at the idea, seeking refuge at Danny's. Like he was their son instead of someone they'd paid. She was working through all the possible scenarios. Some Muslim with nothing to live for strapped into explosives. Another plane crash. And didn't those happen more? It was brilliant to turn a plane into a weapon. The little house felt safe. Amanda understood. I need my clothes. I need clean clothes. Ruth looked toward Amanda. Oh, of course. I just need to go into my closet. They rented the house, but they'd never actually seen strangers inside of it. They always had Rosa in before they came out. They always found the house spotless and chilled and ready to receive them. Clay's just getting dressed. I'll ask him to hurry. Ruth didn't need to say anything about the look on their faces, but they'd opened the door to them. Guess who's coming to dinner? Thank you. Ruth was 63 years old. She hadn't been raised to do, though they had been expected, but to convince. This was her mother understood, how women made their way in the world, convincing men to do things they wanted. I'm scared, she was confessing. Maya and the boys, she's probably trying to call us. Our daughter, G.H. explained. He put his hand on his wife's shoulder. Don't worry about that right now. She mostly could bear not thinking about the ice caps or the president. She could hold fear at bay by focusing on the small matter of her own life. You remember that year when we went to Italy? Dry heat, a luxury hotel, Maya in her pigtails. They'd sipped glasses of sweet juice. They'd eaten pizza topped with rosemary and potatoes. They'd rented a car. They'd stayed in a villa in the country. It was a flat, near treeless place with the mercy of a swimming pool. Maya, taking in the rubble that was the Forum, asked why they'd come there to see a place so wholly wrecked. History meant nothing to her. Time was unimaginable at 9, but it was at 63 too. There was only that moment, the current moment, this life. What made you think of that? I don't know what else to think about, Ruth said. Yeah, I don't know if you noticed the cat in the background, but she does that from time to time. Chapter 15. Rose turned The Secret of the Deer over and over, as you would a hard candy on your tongue. She was not old enough yet that her words would be believed. They would say she had made it up. They would say she had exaggerated. They would say she was a child, but Rose felt the change in the day, even if no one else did. For starters, it was hot, impossibly so. Given the sun had not fully come up, the air felt artificial, like inside a greenhouse or some botanical garden exhibition. The morning was too quiet. It was telling her something. She tried to hear what. In the kitchen, her father was talking to an old man she'd never seen. Rose did not bother reminding her father that she'd been supposed to come see her outside. It was better than she had forgotten. He made introductions. Nice to meet you. Rose was well brought up. A pleasure. G.H. couldn't help but think of his own daughter. He'd remembered he'd used her name for the combination to the lockbox. Did you brush your teeth? Clay wanted to get rid of the girl. It's super hot out. Can I swim? Fine with me. Just find your mother first. Tell her I said it was okay. I need to talk to Mr. Washington. In the night, somehow, each man had forgotten the other, would have been unable to describe him to a police sketch artist. They said eyewitnesses were unreliable anyways. The most people cared only for themselves. This was true of both of these men. Rudderless without precedent for etiquette, and a house to which each had laid claim. Seeing the man again in the day's light was like seeing a stranger with whom you'd had sex. G.H., would you mind if we stepped outside? It sounded so masculine and decisive if you didn't know that Clay wanted a cigarette. Let's do that. G.H. chuckled a little. It was hard to not assume the role of genial sitcom neighbor. Television created the context, and black people had to play along. But this was his house. He thought the protagonist of his story. They left through the side door. GH was proprietary about even the grounds. Thicket was right. The lawn petered, but at a wall of trees. It was different than having a home at the sea. The ocean loomed. The trees were protective. Hot out. He looked at the sky and noted how pale it was. Clay produced cigarettes from his pocket. A little vice, I'm sorry. GH understood, man to man. Men didn't say such things anymore. They just implied them. Once it had been one of the secretary's responsibilities to empty the desktop ashtrays. Now you didn't even say secretary, but assistant. I understand. They walked past the hedgerow. The gravel scrunched pleasantly underfoot. Clay went farther than necessary. The hedge obscured them. The children would not see. Because he felt this was respectful, I wouldn't smoke in the house, you know. There's a reason we ask for a security deposit. They'd had fine luck with renters. A broken wine glass, a loose doorknob, a missing soap dish that Ruth had replaced with a large seashell. Amanda told you what she saw? The news alerts? These didn't worry him. Only the one that was gibberish. He worried about the technology more than the nation. GH nodded. Do you know what I do for a living? I manage money. And do you know what you need to do that job? Information. That's it. Well, money, but information. You can't make choices. You can't assess risk unless you know something. But Clay wanted to be the one. Clay wanted to put everyone at ease. Clay was just selfish enough. I'm going to drive into town. It's the only way. I suspect it's terrorism, but that's not what scares me. Terrorists are dumb hicks. That's how you convince them to incinerate themselves for God. They're patsies, but what comes next? GH once had faith in the institutions of American life, but he had less now. Let's say something happens in New York City. Do you think this president will do the right thing about it? This kind of thing used to sound like paranoia, but now it was just pragmatism. Well, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Clay was proud of himself. His chest swelled in some primate's instinct. My contractor lives just a few miles down the road. He's a good man. I trust him. He could head over there. GH was mostly thinking out loud. Clay was relieved by the nicotine. We're safe out here, I think. GH was less certain. It seems so, at the moment. I don't think we need to bother your friend. I'm going to go into town, buy a newspaper, find someone who knows more than we do. I'd say I'd join you, but I'm not sure if Ruth would approve. He was a deal maker by trade. He didn't want to go. You stay here. Clay was thinking on some level of his father. You see those rentals where the homeowner is on the premises. Host, it's really not so odd. He worried about them driving more. He thought it was decent of him. He wanted to be seen to be good. GH looked again at the sky. It looks like it might be a nice day. Very hot out already. When you got older, you could say that kind of thing, as though you were somehow in tune with nature's secret rhythms. As though GH had spent his life on a fishing trawler instead of a midtown skyscraper. Maybe he'd have a swim. Clay looked up too. The yellow was setting into blue. He'd thought it seemed like rain, and now it felt like summer. How wrong they'd been. Once again, I apologize for the kitty, but she's not super well potty trained, so it is what it is. Chapter 16. He pressed the button twice to lower all four windows simultaneously. Clay appreciated this feature, the brainstorm of one particularly insightful engineer who understood that on a hot day the first thing you wanted was air. There was, though, a kind of pleasure in the close, dry heat inside the car. Flecks of dust, the way you could smell the sunlight. The wheels made a particular noise on the gravel, then cleared that and moved slowly over the asphalt. he drove slowly, nonchalant, to make himself feel the more brave. Also, he'd figured the longer these people stayed, the more right he had to their $1,000. There was a field of something being cultivated, but Clay had no idea what it was. Were soybeans the same as edamame, or were they something else? And what could they be used for? He drove slowly past the little shack selling eggs. The road was an intermediate thing, still narrow, not quite real. He waited for the GPS to register. But hadn't he found the way to the shore only yesterday morning? Clay knew what he was doing. Someone had once told him that people found smoking calming because it was essentially deep breathing. There was no shoulder, so he simply stopped in the road, turned the machine off, to press the button to bring the windows back up in beautiful unison. He had stood 10 feet away because he did not want the smell of smoke to permeate the car. There was that familiar, pure rush of satiety. There was an almost swoon. He had nothing to lean on, so he simply drew himself up taller and looked around at the world, which was quiet. He had a fleeting desire for the clarity of a cold Coke, to shake off the vague hangover. That's what he would do. He would drive down the road, turn onto the main road, wind around the curves, and end up at that four-way intersection, and instead of bearing right toward the sea, he'd go left toward the town. There was a gas station. There was a public library. There was a junk stop and an ice cream parlor and a motel. Farther down the road of those depressing, low-lying complexes with a grocery store, a drugstore, dry cleaner, and chain sandwich shop tidily arrayed before a parking lot that's so large it would never fill up. That's where he would go in search of knowledge, not to the library, but to the place where things were sold. You could get a Coke almost anywhere. Clay looked at his phone. Habit was powerful. It showed him nothing. He dropped the cigarette and stepped on it, then got back into the car. The brain was a marvel. You could drive without wholly thinking about driving. Sure, familiar routes, the everyday commute, start the car, find the highway, maneuver through lanes, taking the usual exit, glide to stops at red lights, move forward at green ones, while not exactly hearing the top stories being reiterated on NPR, or thinking about some slight at the office, or remembering a production of The Pirates of Penzance you saw the summer between 6th and 7th grades. Driving was rote. It was something that you just did. He wasn't actually thinking about the production of The Pirates of Penzance he'd seen the summer between 6th and 7th grades, though he remembered that as the golden temporary season in which he'd still been his mother's favorite child. But he must have been thinking about something, because Clay turned at some point and drove some distance. He found estimated distance and measures of volume impossible, and realized that though he was definitely on a road, a more serious two-laned road, the sort of road the GPS would know and name. He could not be certain, not really, that it was the road he'd wanted. There were directions written down in Amanda's notebook, of course. But Amanda's notebook was back at the house, in Amanda's Vuitton bag. Anyway, the ability to take written directions to one destination and simply invert them to move in reverse was an obsolete art. It was like winding the car windows down with a crank. Human progress. Clay was lost. Everything was very green. There was nothing to hold on to. There were some trees, there was a field, a glimpse of a roof, and a promise of a building. But he couldn't say whether it was a barn or a house. The road curved, and then he emerged somewhere else where there was another field and some more trees. Another slice of roof of a barn or a house, and Clay thought of those old cartoons that recycled their backgrounds to create the illusion of movement. It was impossible to say what was more sensible, to stop the car and backtrack, or to forge ahead as though he knew where he was going. He didn't even know how long he'd been driving, or whether he'd know the turn back onto the road that led to the gravel driveway up to the house where his family waited. He didn't know whether that road was marked by a sign or what the sign would say. Maybe he ought to have paid closer attention. Maybe he ought to have taken this errand more seriously. The sound of the wind, the sensation of it on his face, was distracting. Clay slowed the car a little and sent the windows back up, then jabbed at the center panel until the air conditioning came to life. He continued straight, but that wasn't exactly correct, since the road undulated and twisted and maybe had gone in a complete circuit. That was why trees and the occasional buildings looked so familiar, because they were. He had a piece of gum and grabbed a piece of gum and put it in his mouth. Fine. There were no other cars, and he didn't know if that seemed odd or not. Anyways, it was not the kind of road for stop signs. The local planners trusted the local people. He pulled onto the dusty shoulder and turned the car around and drove in the direction from which he'd come. Now nothing looked familiar. Though he had just driven through it, it was all inverted, and he noticed things on the left side of the road he'd missed, and when they had been on his right. An amateurish painted sign reading McKinnon's Farms, a lone horse standing in a field, the remains of a building that had burned down. He drove and then slowed, because he felt he must be close to the turn back to the house. But he couldn't take that. He would drive on in the other direction, where he knew the town waited. There was a road on his right, and he turned to look up it as he passed, but it was not a road that led to the house, because that road that had a little painted shack where you could get a dozen eggs for $5. He sped up and drove on. There was another turnoff, but again, no painted shack. Then he wondered whether he'd turn twice to get to the road where he now found himself, and was looking for a landmark that did not exist. Clay took out his phone, though he knew you weren't supposed to look on your phone as you drove, and was surprised that it did not seem to be working. Then he remembered that, of course, it had not been working. That was the real purpose of this errand, not an ice-cold Coke. He had driven out to show everyone that he was a man in control, and now he was lost and felt ridiculous. He tossed the phone into the seat beside him. Of course there were no other cars. These were rural roads, and the convenience of a handful of people. The day only seemed strange because the night had been strange. He was a little turned around, but he would find his way. He hadn't gone so far that he needed to be rescued. He thought of how the government sent helicopters for the antisocial weirdos who insisted on living atop wildfire-prone mountains. People thought fire a disaster. Failing to understand it was an important part of life cycle of the forest. The old burned, the new grew. Clay kept driving. What else was he supposed to do? So that's all she wrote. That was chapter 14, 15, and 16. Hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I apologize again for the kitty. Love y'all.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.